I'm not sure the shareholders' profits are any better. Okay, so the question was, could we also argue that there are marginal external benefits associated with this? So that if you're producing the aircraft, especially if it's a new aircraft, you probably have newer technologies, and those newer technologies can be very valuable not only in the aircraft industry, but in other industries as well. So you can have positive externalities. And the answer is yes, there could be. And now we're back to all the issues that we had earlier with marginal external benefits. How big are they? Would we have access to those marginal external benefits even if the product were produced in the other country? Now, it may be very different when you're thinking about Europe versus the United States to say an aircraft industry or no industry. But that's not actually what we've been talking about here. What we're talking about is a particular product within the industry, a super jumbo jet, being produced either by Airbus or by Boeing. Not to say that if you don't produce it, the whole company goes away. They got other products that they're already producing. So there may be, if you think you've got huge unemployment in the Seattle area, that the marginal external benefits are greater because you can put a lot of unemployed aerospace workers back to work. But again, one always has to ask, at what cost, and how sure are you about those marginal external benefits, and is that, in fact, the best way to go about the problem? You had a question?
Yeah, in regards to the matrix that you had up earlier, if you have the countries subsidizing, I know that you start arms trade, but if the countries subsidize $6 billion to each country, then the countries have a net gain, right? As long as they have a positive incentive to produce, that would be a net collision, right?
Yes, if both produce. If the best decision for both firms is produce no matter what, then the upper left will be the Nash equilibrium.
Right. So instead of subsidizing 20, subsidize 6.
Okay.
That would still be the Nash equilibrium.
Right.
And then the net effect is going to be positive.
No, because if you're only subsidizing by 6, then the payout is 1, right? So you're starting with your loss, which is your operating loss, and then you add the subsidy to it. So you've got minus 6 operating loss and plus 6 subsidy, so your payout is plus 1. So that would say produce, but the subsidy still costs 6, so your loss is 5. Yeah, as long as the loss is 5, you can't get away from, and both countries produce with this kind of cost structure, you've got a problem. Okay, so let's take a different situation. Now let's assume that Boeing actually has a comparative advantage or a cost advantage in terms of producing this new airplane. So let's see if this changes anything. So let's assume that Airbus is, okay, let's go, if Boeing produces, they earn 125, and if Boeing produces and Airbus doesn't, Airbus obviously would not have any gains or losses. If Boeing doesn't produce, they would have 0. If Airbus does produce, we'll assume that they have a profit of 100. Now notice that the profit is less than what Boeing will have if Boeing is the only producer. And the reason for that is we're assuming that Boeing has a cost advantage in production. So they can produce at a lower cost. We've got zeros down here. If nobody produces, nobody gets money. And let's assume that if they both produce, that Airbus will lose 20, but Boeing will make 5 because they're so much more productive or efficient in the production of airplanes. Now, the EU gives a $25 million subsidy to Airbus if it produces. So that means that if Boeing drops out, they make 125, but if Boeing continues to produce, they make 5. That's a plus. Again, we can see our Nash equilibrium, the outcome of our game. It now still makes sense for both companies to produce. And so our Nash equilibrium will be in our upper left-hand corner or quadrant. Both companies are making money, both are producing. But if we look at Airbus's profits and see that Airbus's profits were 5, EU government subsidy was 25, so the loss to the EU is 20. Once again, yes? Could be. I mean, that'd be one way of having that is if they started production first, they could have dynamic learning curve advantages. It may be that they have access to less costly raw materials. Labor may be less expensive, or labor rules may be less expensive. They may have a better design. They may have smarter managers. They may have like 2 Haas graduates or Ford Berkeley graduates running the shop, and so they can just make things more cheaply than the French can. It depends on where we are on the, I mean, if we're talking dynamic learning curves, it depends on where we are on the curve. I mean, it doesn't fall forever, remember, and it does flatten out. So it just depends. I mean, I don't think we want to get caught up I mean, we could, but I don't think we want to get caught up in what happens in the next 5-year period when cost structures might change yet again. But what we could say is if one firm drops out, it's real unlikely they're going to come back into the market in a later time period, regardless of what happens to the first firm's cost structure. So all the decisions need to be made up front. Again, it's in part because the fixed cost of starting production is very, very large. Remember, the initial design work that Boeing wrote off on their super jumbo jet was $18 billion. They have no return on that. So what we can say then is Boeing is going to produce no matter what. So Boeing produces, Airbus produces. Okay, so again, Boeing's not deterred. There's no strategic advantage. The subsidy doesn't make any difference, and therefore the European welfare goes down because of the lack of a deterrent effect here. So strategic trade theory seems like it ought to work really well, and indeed, strategic trade theory might be a good thing for an exporting country. Might, remember? It also depends upon what the other country does. So one has to think about not only the game that is taking place between the duopolists, but also the game in the background that's taking place between the governments to provide a subsidy or not to provide a subsidy. So if one government provides a subsidy and the other government retaliates with a similar size subsidy, then all of a sudden the strategic advantage gets lost. But even if we could structure it in a way that we might have some sort of deterrent effect, the amount of information that is actually necessary to pull this off in any sort of successful way is probably much, much more detailed than anything that a government, or for that matter, the firm itself would actually have. Remember, in the example that we're using here, we're talking about the production of a new airplane. Boeing cannot tell you what the Dreamliner is going to cost. Right? And they've got they got prototypes of it, but they can't tell you how much it's really going to cost them to produce. And so when you're sitting there at the beginning of a development cycle, trying to figure out how much it would cost you versus how much it would cost your competitors and what those cost differentials might be, because if you're going to try and use strategic trade theory to promote your exports, you need to have some idea of cost advantages as well as first mover advantages, and that's probably an information requirement that is way, way too severe. The other thing that we need to always be cognizant of when we put in things like the subsidy payments that take place is that once they go into place, they create a beneficiary group, folks that are receiving the subsidy payments. And it becomes very, very difficult to withdraw those subsidy payments. The EU government and the US government have basically negotiated or agreed in principle to reduce their subsidy payments to Airbus and to Boeing 15 years ago. The subsidies are still the same in place today that they were then. Because Boeing is fighting very, very hard to keep their subsidies, as is Airbus. And they always say the same thing. You can reduce our subsidies, but only if they go first, right? But if you have two parties saying you go first, nobody goes first. And so subsidy payments don't go down. And therefore, you've got this, what we call policy capture taking place by the beneficiary groups. So I think that you can probably tell in both cases here, whether we're talking about externalities in the high-tech industry or strategic trade theory in highly concentrated global industries, that conceptually we can make a case for doing both. But from a practical point of view, it's probably difficult to have the right government policy aimed in a way that's going to get us any sort of really, really noticeable results here. Okay, so we do not have class on Thursday. Actually, I think only the veteran should take Thursday off. Anyway, we don't have class on Thursday. I'll see you next Tuesday. You have a problem set due on Tuesday. It's already been posted, so have fun with that, and I'll see you next week.